A brief word on the flagellants. So, in the episode which I released yesterday entitled Martin Luther, Paid Indulgences, and Hurling Ink at the Devil, I very briefly in passing mentioned a group active in medieval Europe during the time of the plague known as the Flagellants. Well, I got a couple of things wrong, and I just want to make sure that I corrected myself as soon as possible. Well, first off, I knew somewhere in my head that they were called the Flagellants, but I noticed while listening back to the episode in question that sounds like I called them the Flagellates, which I don't even think is actually a word. Well, at least I didn't say flatulence. But more importantly, I characterized them as monks, and although certain monastic orders did use flagellation as a form of penance, and individual monks and priests did supposedly join the flagellant movement early on, the majority were simply religious zealots and not members of the clergy. In fact, there was significant tension between the Flagellants and the Roman Catholic Church. The Church tolerated them at first, but the movement grew larger and more violent over time, and eventually the Pope issued a papal bull condemning the movement. So I keep repeating the word flagellant, and for those who might not be familiar, it simply refers to someone who practices self-flagellation, from the Latin word to whip. And in the episodes I've done on the Shroud of Turin, I've mentioned the Roman weapon known as the flagrum, which was supposedly used in the scourging of Christ. I imagine there's probably some shared etymology there. And speaking of the scourging, the flagellant self-mortification via whipping was thought to be an attempt at penance through imitation of the Passion of Christ. The movement grew to the height of its popularity during the time of the Black Death. It was thought that, or at least hoped, that the flagellant's ritual self-mortification would repel the dreaded pestilence. I'll now read an eyewitness account from Robert of Avesbury via eyewitnesstohistory.com. In that same year of 1349, about Michaelmas, September 29, over 600 men came to London from Flanders, mostly of Zeeland and Holland origin. Sometimes at St. Paul's and sometimes at other points in the city. They made 2 daily public appearances, wearing cloths, from the thighs to the ankles, but otherwise stripped bare. Each wore a cap marked with a red cross in front and behind. Each had in his right hand a scourge with 3 tails. Each tail had a knot, and through the middle of it there were sometimes sharp nails fixed. They marched naked in a file one behind the other and whipped themselves with these scourges on their naked and bleeding bodies. 4 of them would chant in their native tongue, and another 4 would chant in response like a litany. Thrice they would all cast themselves on the ground in this sort of procession, stretching out their hands like the arms of a cross. The singing would go on, and the one who was in the rear of those, thus prostrate, acting first, each of them in turn would step over the others and give one stroke with the scourge to the man lying under him. This went on from the first to the last until each of them had observed the ritual to the full tale of those on the ground. Then each put on his customary garments, and always wearing their caps and carrying their whips in their hands, they retired to their lodgings. It is said that every night they performed the same penance. I mentioned in yesterday's episode that the Flagellants had attained almost, and I'm paraphrasing a documentary commentator, rock star status. They started out as a group of devout religious zealots, but over time, with its rise in popularity, the movement began to grow out of control. It eventually attracted a criminal element, and members began hoarding loot stolen from local churches and engaging in sexual relationships with quote-unquote rowdy women. A rampant anti-Semitic streak developed over time as well, and the Flagellants began violently targeting Jews. It wasn't just the Flagellants. Tragically, once again, the Jewish people had found themselves in the unfortunate role of scapegoat, and Christians in general began blaming them for the Black Death. Ugly and groundless rumors about Jews poisoning wells and food supplies spread like wildfire. The movement had grown so out of control that Pope Clement VI, in the year 1349, finally issued his bull condemning them, demanding they disperse and calling on the aid of church leaders in suppressing the group. When the Flagellants ignored the Pope's decree, military action was taken and the movement was suppressed through force. But this wasn't the end of the Flagellants. A few decades later, Pope Gregory XI accused them of heretical practices relating to challenging church authority and claiming the ability to perform miracles. Well, I could go on, but this was merely intended to be a short correction episode, so mission accomplished, I think. Thanks for listening, guys, and until next week.